Hi, everybody. So yeah, as Martin said, we'll go through some features to help Xamarin developers be a little bit more productive with Rider. I know probably a lot of people are using Visual Studio, and my mission here is to get you to at least give Rider a try. And I think if you try it out, you'll probably end up sticking with it. So first, I'm going to introduce myself. So I'm a consultant with BSI Labs based out of Toronto, Canada. I've been working with Xamarin for about 5 years, just a little under 5 years. I've been developing for about 20 years, and about 17 of those have been with C Sharp. So I've been with C Sharp for quite a while, working with C Sharp for quite a while. Um, that'll kind of lead into some of the reasons why I like Rider and some relevant links. So I've got a blog and some social media links, and I run a user group out of Toronto. So if anybody's ever in town and wants to connect, please reach out, and would love to see you at the user group, or maybe if you want to present or anything along those lines. Love the community here. So Rider and this whole presentation is really around tooling, and my personal belief is that tooling is extremely important, particularly to software developers and technical people. So most of our job as technical people is to build tools for business users in a lot of cases. And in the cases of somebody like Martin, he's building his business as developers. So he's building technical tools for developers. So he does for us what we do for our clients generally. So the idea is you want to make sure you're using the best tool for the job, just like you're ensuring you're shipping the best tool for your client's job. So I want to give a bit of insight into what I use for tools. So I use a MacBook Pro. I'm traditionally, as you saw with my extensive C# experience, I come from the Microsoft world. I was traditionally a Windows user. When I got more involved with Xamarin, it became more and more obvious that it was time to give Mac a try, because developing with iOS, there's the whole orchestration between the PC, so Visual Studio for Windows, and Xamarin Studio or Visual Studio for Mac, and the agent on the Mac communicating with Visual Studio adds some overhead and some complexity. The versions have to be aligned. So there's a lot more failure points if you're not developing directly on a Mac. So the idea, really, I switched over to a Mac about, I guess it'd be about 3 years ago, and really have stuck with it. And the reason why I've stuck with it is because it presents the best of both worlds. So like I said, MacBook Pro, I recently got one of the dongle books. I was originally on one of the older models, I think a 2015 model, which had all the ports, which was fantastic. But I've kind of been forced into a corner where I have to get the new version with USB-C or Thunderbolt. It's not as bad as I expected, but yeah, I'm still running Mojave. I won't venture down Catalina. I've seen some feedback and people are seeing some issues with it. So I'm personally not going to recommend Catalina, but feel free. So one of the reasons why I like Mac is because of Parallels and Boot Camp. So I run a Boot Camp partition with Windows installed on it, and then I can boot that as basically I can boot the actual hard drive partition as a VM through Parallels. So really, I get the best of both worlds. If I need the raw next to the metal performance, I can use Boot Camp, but for most cases, a VM will do. So sometimes you need Windows for Visual Studio if you're working on .NET Framework or something like that. My primary IDE is JetBrains Rider. I use Rider every day, and I have been for about a year. It's really changed the way I develop. For a long time, I was switching back and forth between Visual Studio for Mac and Rider, and now I tend to live in Rider for almost all purposes. There's the rare exception where I'll look at Visual Studio for a few different things, and that tends to be the new hot reload functionality if I'm doing UI heavy work. And I'll often drop in to look at the project templates just to see what Visual Studio has been working into, the Visual Studio team has been working into the new project templates in Visual Studio for Mac. So as I said, I'm primarily a .NET C# developer. I work a lot with ASP.NET Core and Xamarin. I work with Azure Services a lot, and I work with Azure DevOps a lot. So I think, judging by the title, I'm not sure how many people are unfamiliar with Xamarin, but Xamarin is a cross-platform framework for developing mobile apps, so you can develop against Android and iOS with a single code base. Android and iOS are the two target platforms that are largest, have the largest usage, but you can also target UWP, you can target tvOS, watchOS, Android Wear devices, Tizen devices, so Samsung's Tizen platform, WebAssembly, and so it keeps growing and expanding and evolving, and there's lots more going on. macOS is another one that I missed, but lots of target platforms, but primarily iOS and Android is the place where I live. I really like the decreased cognitive load that comes with this. So having one code base written in one language and one UI language with primarily, if you're using Xamarin Forms, being able to build your forms or build your screens with XAML is really nice and really decreases the work that has to go into building a mobile app, rather than having two code bases with two different UI frameworks and the whole thing. If you're dealing with like Android, Kotlin, Java, or iOS, Objective-C, Swift World. So I'm a big fan of Xamarin. So let's talk a little bit about what Rider is. So JetBrains has been around for a long time. They're originally called IntelliJ, and they really started out in the Java world. And their big IDE platform was IntelliJ IDEA, and that was released back in the early 2000s. From there, they kind of extended what they were doing tooling-wise and built a tool called ReSharper. So ReSharper was a Visual Studio add-in. That's the first icon here. So ReSharper was a Visual Studio extension that gave you nice refactoring and productivity tools, code generation tools to work on C# code. I was a big fan of ReSharper. The first time I tried it was back, I think, in around 2005. And at that time, Visual Studio didn't have a lot of refactoring tools. And really, since that time, Visual Studio has taken a lot of the, or borrowed a lot of the functionality that ReSharper had out of the in the extension and tried to roll it into the product. Now, that being said, Visual Studio still hasn't kept pace with the JetBrains team, and there continues to be a lot more in the ReSharper product that that isn't baked into Visual Studio. And particularly this was the case with Visual Studio for Mac, because there wasn't a lot of code sharing between Visual Studio for Mac and Visual Studio for Windows up until like relatively recently. So JetBrains kind of looked at this and went, okay, well, it would be really nice to take ReSharper and combine it with our IntelliJ IDEA shell and build a new IDE for .NET, a nice cross-platform IDE. So that's where Rider comes from. So it's really ReSharper, the ReSharper engine, plus the IntelliJ IDEA front end combined, and that makes Rider. So there's a whole story of how this was done. I think Martin co-authored this article. I've left a link at the bottom here, a tiny URL link, building-rider. Go and check that out. It's a really great read on how this product is actually put together. So I really like Rider because of these refactoring and code generation tools. It's cross-platform, so I can use it in Windows and in Mac, and it feels the same in both. So it is a Java application, but Java kind of carries a bit of a bad rap, and I think it's a little undue because particularly looking at something like Rider, it's a really nice UI, makes a lot of sense, and it doesn't really feel clunky at all. So yeah, don't write it off because it's written in Java, because I know some people tend to write off anything written in Java. And got to remember, Android for the longest time was all Java, so don't judge. And yeah, the intelligent editing and analysis tools that are built into the IDE are just fantastic. So it gives you a lot of suggestions and improvements on how to make sure your code is well factored, well written, all that kind of great stuff. So it really helps you write better quality code. So how do you get started with Rider from Mac? The first thing is you want to get all the prerequisites prepped. So you need Xcode, that's your first stop. So making sure that you have access to download Xcode through Apple's ecosystem and get Xcode installed on your Mac machine. That gives you the ability to actually build and run iOS apps and launch the simulators and all that kind of good stuff. The next piece is the JetBrains Toolbox. The JetBrains Toolbox is really nice because it gives you access to all the JetBrains IDE tools and keep them up to date. So it gives you automatic updates, lets you launch right from the JetBrains Toolbox, and gives you a list of recent projects. So if you're working across multiple IDEs, which I know a lot of us often do, you've got it right at your fingertips there. So that's handy. Android Studio, I personally like to install Android Studio through the JetBrains Toolbox. This gives you all the Android development tools. So if you do need to do something that's written in Kotlin or in Java, you've got the tools pre-installed. It also gives you all the SDK tools and all those kind of bits that you need to build Android as well. So probably a good idea to install Android Studio. Then you want to install Rider. Again, it's just one click through the JetBrains Toolbox. And you want to install Visual Studio for Mac. I mark this as optional because Rider does have options to get this all installed, or all the prerequisites that come with Visual Studio can also come through Rider. But I do like having Visual Studio alongside Rider, just for the reasons I explained earlier. So some of the hot reload functionality that's built into Visual Studio is nice, and then the project templates tend to be evolved, I think is a good way of putting them. So they work in new bits into the templates and things like that, into the project templates. So once you've got it and have all your prereqs installed, the next thing you want to do is launch Rider. And when you launch Rider, you'll be prompted with what you need to go off and install to get your environment prepped for running or building and running Android apps. So you need .NET Core, you need Mono, you need Xamarin Android, Xamarin iOS, and Mac. So you use Rider's prompts to get those all installed. It's a pretty quick and easy process, and then you're up and running. So let's go look at Rider. So once you've got it installed, of course, you want to go and use the IDE, and let's do that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through what a typical kind of day in the life scenario looks like in Rider. So first, let's talk about the screen you're greeted with when you launch Rider. So you've got your typical new and open dialog here. One of the things that's really kind of nice here is right from the splash screen here, the launch screen, you've got your ability to check out directly from version control. This is really nice, just gets you right into your workflow. There's no mucking around or trying to figure out how to get that configured or set up. So it's right here from your first stop. We're not going to work with version control much in this demo, so I'm actually going to start with the new solution. And this brings you into the project template. So as you can see, there's quite a few templates here just right out of the box. Rider does support basically any of the templates offered by the new .NET News system. So The .NET CLI has a bunch of templates built into it that are actually packaged as NuGet files, and you can bring any of those into Rider. So you can do that with the new template dialog. They've got a nice website where you can kind of go and browse the available templates and install them for usage in Rider. We're not going to touch any of that today. Just want to make sure everybody's aware. So we're going to start with a Xamarin application, and we'll call this Rider demo. And we're going to create cross-platform. I'm not going to use Git for this one in particular, or maybe I will. Sure, why not? Cross-platform, so you can select either targeting at one specific platform or do cross-platform. The type, you can have a pure native, so you can create a solution that has the native solutions in it with a shared code library, or you can do a Xamarin Forms solution, which creates the template using Xamarin Forms, so your UI is shared as well. I tend to work in Xamarin Forms 95% of the time, so we're going to go with Xamarin Forms. The code sharing strategy, there's .NET Standard and Shared Library. Shared Library tends to not be used very much anymore. It can be used if you're doing the native UI. So if you're building storyboards for iOS and Android XML for your Android project, then the shared library is an approach you may want to use. But I find it kind of not very clean. .NET Standard, really you have to use precompiler directives in your shared library to specify which platform you're running which code on. And it kind of gets messy. .NET Standard tends to use more of an abstracted approach where things are interface based, and you're injecting things from your head projects where you need platform specifics, and it tends to just be a little bit cleaner design. So we're going to use Android Pie and iOS 12, and it gives you a little preview of how things are going to be laid out. And this is kind of interesting because if we check this box, we can see how it changes the structure. And it's really funny because this is always something like back in my early days that used to confuse me. I'm like, well, why do I want this option? And here you get a clear idea of how it's actually going to structure the file system. Then we've got some just basic info around the project template. And yeah, that's how we're going to set up our project. So let's go and create that. So it's creating our solution file, and away we go. Good stuff. It's doing some updates. So the first thing I want to kind of look at it, and the first thing that's kind of interesting when you go to build a project from scratch is a lot of the times the templates, and this isn't a Rider specific issue, this is just a template specific issue. Templates come with a predefined package versions, a set of predefined package versions in them. So what I generally do right out of the gate when I start a new project is I go in and I take a look at what versions I'm running of various packages. So what's installed, what are my predefined dependencies, and what do those look like? So I'm just going to take a quick opportunity to point out the solution window here, or the solution view. This looks very similar to the Solution Explorer and behaves very similar to the Solution Explorer in Visual Studio. So you should feel right at home if you're a Visual Studio user. And things work pretty similarly. So if I right click on the actual solution, up here I have a Manage NuGet Packages option. So I'm going to select that now, and it's going to bring up the NuGet Package Manager. And let's take a look at what we have installed here. So we've got some Android support libraries, we've got Xamarin Forms, and we've got .NET Standard. So as you can see, this looks quite a bit different than the package manager for Visual Studio, either Windows or Mac. And it tends to be something that can throw people off. And I think what I'm going to try and do here is really emphasize how much better this package management tool is. So let's start from the beginning. So I'm going to get rid of that, and let's go back in. So look at how fast, like this is cached now, but look at how fast, even last time when it was cold, the speed in which it loaded those list of packages was incredibly fast. I wasn't waiting for it to pull all the data in and display it. It was done. It was loading it in as the data was flowing into the back to my NuGet client here. So you'll see that again if I uncheck pre-release, it loads things again, and you can see how quick that is. So it's very quick turnaround for this, which is awesome. So the other thing is we can change our scope really easily. I know in Visual Studio for Windows, your scope is not necessarily, or your scope is kind of set depending on where you open your NuGet package manager from. And I know they're working on that, but it still like has a long way to go as far as I'm concerned. So really at this point, I think this is more Visual Studio building from the JetBrains, or borrowing from the JetBrains team to implement some of the similar approaches. So we can change our scope right here. So we can say, okay, well, I only want to look at my Rider demo, which is my Xamarin Forms project, or I only want to look at my iOS project, or I want to look across my whole solution. So let's start with this. Let's look across our whole solution, and I'm going to update this. I'm not going to go as high as 4.0, but I'm going to go up to the latest 3.6 libraries, and I'm going to hit my upgrade button. It prompts me that I want to make sure that I'm going to upgrade it in all projects. And of course, my Android is not going to cooperate. That's fine. We're going to largely ignore Android for this demo anyways. The Android support libraries are, you know, for anybody who's worked with Xamarin, the Android support libraries tend to be a bit of a hassle. So I'm just going to unload and ignore the Android project just for the purposes of this demo. To get that sorted out, generally what you do is you would manually edit the package or edit the project file and make sure that you have the aligned versions. And the Visual Studio, or not the Visual Studio team, but the Xamarin team has done some work to consolidate those packages to make it a little easier to manage, but it's still not quite there. It still tends to be something finicky and frustrating. So for the purposes of this demo, there we've updated to Xamarin Forms 3.6, which is great. And let's just start by, let's make sure that we have a running app right out of the gate here. I probably should have done that before we upgraded the packages, but this is fine. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to set some defaults. So I'll draw some attention here to before I actually launch to this dialog. So here you've got your solution configuration, and here you've got your run configuration. So your solution configuration is pretty straightforward. Looks very similar to what you'd see in Visual Studio. The one thing you'll find is if you need to edit your solution configuration, it is quite a bit faster. I know it tends to be a large pain point, particularly with large projects for me on both Visual Studio for Windows and Visual Studio for Mac. JetBrains Rider tends to do a better job at managing the solution configuration. So if you want to make changes to this, it's a lot faster and easier to apply those changes. If anybody here has done any advanced solution configuration management in the past, I know it's been a headache for me using Visual Studio. We don't need to modify any of that. We're going to use the iPhone simulator. So I'm going to edit my run configuration here. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it that I don't want to, when I launch the iOS project, I don't want it to open a select deployment target dialog. And I'll quickly show you what that looks like. So out of the box, if I hit go on this, it's going to prompt me to edit the configuration and open the dialog. So if I hit debug here, it's going to give me this select deployment target, which is always, if this comes up and you have to deal with this every time, it becomes an irritant, and it becomes something that you can easily launch two emulators and kind of have some window overload. So what I like to do is I like to edit that configuration to automatically launch a simulator, and I tend to pick the latest iPhone and go from there. And away we go. So now if I click this, it's not going to prompt me. It's going to build my project, and run it up. So while this is doing this, while this is going and launching here, I want to talk a little bit more about the solution window here, or the solution view. So there's very few differences between this and Visual Studio if you're used to working with Visual Studio. The one thing you will see is that in Visual Studio, you actually, when you start looking and expanding a class file, you get the class structure, and that hasn't been included in Rider for a good reason. I always wondered why Visual Studio put that into the Solution Explorer. It seemed like an odd way to do things because you're looking at file structure and solution structure, not necessarily class structure. If you wanted to, it's automatically prompting me for git ignore there. I'm going to click add. That's a very nice feature. I didn't even realize that was there. The way you'll view a class structure in Rider is to use the structure window here. So under view tool windows, if I go to structure, it's going to give me the structure of my main page class that I have selected here. And of course, it's only got a constructor, so there's nothing really interesting going on there, but you can see that it clearly has the structure displayed. Now, in the meantime, my app has launched, so I've got a Xamarin Forms 3.6 app going here, which is great. Excellent. So let's start talking a little bit, or let's continue our now that we know we have a working solution, let's continue talking about this window here. So similar to Visual Studio, there's also a file system view here where you can actually look at the raw file system for this whole solution. So we can see the git ignore that's been added. We can see our .settings user preferences file. We can see our idea preferences files that have been added by Rider. So these are Rider preferences files, which are great. And we can see our Git. We can look at our full folder structure with our bin and OBJ folders with our build artifacts in them, which is great. So we get the raw file system view if we need it. But one of the nice things here is the assemblies view. So the assemblies view is really handy if you need to look at something that's been delivered pre-compiled. Like say there's a library, a closed source library or something that you don't know how it's working. You can load up an assembly here, and let's actually just use, let's see what's in here. I actually might not have any assemblies in here. I should have picked more wisely. So I'm going to actually use one of my libraries here, HTTP tracer, and I'm going to look in my bin folder here and say I wanted to look at how HTTP tracer was working. I could load up that file. Or I loaded a folder, didn't I? Yes, I did. Let's load up this file. So I've got the raw assembly here, and I can browse this assembly. So I can browse through it and take a look at what each piece of this library is doing. And the nice thing about this is similar to ReSharper, and I think Visual Studio has even put this in place now, is I can go and browse through the decompiled code that belongs to this assembly, which is nice, particularly if you've got something closed source. So the assemblies window is pretty nice and allows you to look through closed source solutions, which is excellent. So let's talk a little bit more about navigation, because that's mainly what our solution window is doing. So the first thing that I like to draw attention to, and that is my personal favorite feature of Rider, is Command T, the search everywhere feature. So what I can do here is I can start typing basically anything in the entire solution, and it will bring it up for me. So, and it understands the concept of Pascal case. So if I'm looking for main page and I type MP, it'll find main page, which is great. And this also works for things like, as you can see, actions and application features down below. So this is like your search. It'll search absolutely everything code related to your solution and related to Rider. So you get it kind of all in one really easy to use dialog, which is awesome. So this is basically how I get around, but there are some alternatives. And one of the things I'll point out is I've got a really bad habit of just from my, I guess from my roots and being around in the .NET space for so long and manually traversing my solution folders, I will still go through and expand out folders and dig around and look for the file. And with Rider, you've got this nice little breadcrumb here. So say I want to look for another file that I know is in the Rider demo. I know where it is relative to this file. I know it's in Rider demo. I can jump to it right from here. So this breadcrumb is really nice, where you don't have to go in and expand out your solution structure. You can navigate it right from every stage of the breadcrumb. So it's a very nice way of getting around your project. So that's a really nice way of doing it. And then of course you can navigate using the structure view if you happen to have it open, which is nice. Click on a method, it'll take you to the method. Click on a property, it'll take you to the property. It's a good way of getting around your code and seeing things in a nice navigation structure. And this kind of, I really like to keep this open because I'm used to the 2 drop-down windows in the top of Visual Studio, where you can declare or not declare, but select your scope and select your method to navigate to it. And I actually find this tree view a little bit more helpful, a little bit more straightforward. And once the structure window is open, it's more discoverable as well. I found that a lot of younger developers and more junior developers that I've worked with through the years didn't even notice those drop-down lists up above. But as soon as you show them the structure window, they immediately gravitate to it and use it to get around their code. So it's a very intuitive way of viewing your class and navigating through your class structure. Okay, so that's quite a bit about navigation. So Rider makes it pretty easy to get around your code. Now, how about writing code? So the first thing I want to talk about is some of the snippets built in. So let's say we're using, well, let's go and create a class here. So in Xamarin, you should be using MVVM. So really at this point with this out of the box project template, we don't have any MVVM patterns. We've just got a simple page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a view model class. And I'm going to tell this to not prompt and automatically have this added to Git. Okay, so I've got my view model class, and this of course needs to implement I notify property changed, so we can inform our front end that our data has changed and we need to redraw the screen. So the first thing you'll see is as soon as I put in, specify that I'm inheriting or implementing an interface here, it's going to underline this in red because of course my main view model doesn't satisfy the contract that I notify property change provides. So, okay, great. So let's get that implemented. So I just hit Alt Enter there. You can see through my nice little plugin. That plugin's called the Presentation Assistant. I really like it for this kind of thing. It tells me that I've hit Alt Enter, which is great. And I hit Alt Enter, it gives me the tip that, hey, I can implement I notify property change for you. So Rider can do this, generate this code for me. And I know this is not super revolutionary. So this part is kind of interesting. So could not locate resharper annotations in the current solution. So it asks to add what we need to do or include the annotations file in the current project right now. So it allows us to action it right from knowing exactly what it needs to do. So I'm going to say yes, have it bring in, and there's my onProperty change. So now I can use my onProperty changed event in my view model, which is great. Good way to get up and running. So that's a nice little piece of code that Rider will write for me. The other thing I want to touch on here is snippets. So very similar to Visual Studio, there's a whole snippets ecosystem built into ReSharper and Rider, and gives you lots of nice and easy shortcuts to generate code on the fly as you're writing it. So I'm going to generate a constructor here, which is great. So usually in our constructors, we have some dependencies. So let's create some dependencies here. Let's just create, let's see, we'll call this public class, or let's define an interface, public interface, and we'll call this data fetch service. Create a little interface, and we'll have it bring back a, let's just have it be a list, or sorry, an iList of, and ReSharper's helping us along the way here, so it sees that we don't have a reference to iList. I'm gonna hit Alt-Enter, it's gonna bring in the using statement. And we'll just say an iList, a string for now. I'm not exactly sure what kind of data we're gonna get yet. And I'm gonna call this get data. Okay, so we've got an interface. Now I wanna define an implementation of that interface. So what I'm gonna do here, I thought there was an easier way to do this. Let me do it here. I'm gonna go public, create a class called data fetch service. Data fetch service. Again, I'm gonna have ReSharper implement that method for me, or Rider implement that method for me. It's old habits die hard, right? And we'll just have this create a new list of strings. So we'll go return new list of string. Of course, it's helping us along the way. I'm gonna use my collection initializer here, and I'm gonna go test1, test2, test3. Great. So we all know that C# has some nice nice shortcuts for this now, and it's giving me a tip. So I hit Alt-Enter because I see I see two things here. I see in the left-hand margin, I see a little hammer, which I know that it's giving me an action to help refactor my code. And in the right-hand margin, I'm seeing a little green dash, and that green dash is indicating that, hey, there's a suggestion here that you could use to make your code a little bit cleaner. So I'm going to use this suggestion, and I'm going to put this get data method into an expression body to simplify it down to a one-liner, which is nice. Great. So, okay, great. So we've got our data fetch service all set up, and I want to use it in my main view model. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to ask for my data fetch service, and I'm going to call that, and you get some nice name suggestion here. So I'm going to say, so that was just pressing Control Space, gave me the option to insert my suggested name. So I'm going to insert data fetch service. And the next thing I'm going to do is this is immediately giving me some suggestions here. And I'm going to introduce a read-only field data fetch service. So if you're using dependency injection, this makes it really easy to set up your dependencies. So I hit enter there. You can see it initializes it in the constructor body and creates us a read-only property of type iDataFetchService with the proper naming convention, which is a really, really nice, handy thing to do in just like a couple of keystrokes. So it helps you kind of get that speed, that velocity to build what you need to build, which is great. Okay, so what's next here? So I'm not going to use true dependency injection. I'm just going to do this the lazy man way. What I am going to do though is I don't like these classes being in the same file, or this interface in this class being in the same file on my main view model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my helper here and my Alt-Enter key to move this to a separate service file. Now you'll see that as soon as I hit that arrow out, I can actually say I can expand my scope. So I can expand the scope to the file, the project, and the solution. So of course, you're going to want to be careful with this because you don't want to make big sweeping changes like this if some things are done intentionally. So I've seen a lot of projects that keep a bunch of enumerations in a single file just to keep it a little tidy. And I've had people go in and blow them apart into 20 different files and just create a bunch of noise. So got to be careful with that. But we're definitely going to use it for file in this case because we've got 3 types in this file, and we really only want to have 1 type per file, unless you're a monster. So there we go, just 1 keystroke, and it's broken it into separate files. Let's take this 1 step further because I don't like things sitting on my root here. So I'm going to use some of the refactoring tools just from the File Explorer menu. So if I right-click and I go into the Refactor This menu, I can move this to a folder right from here. So I can go Target Folder, Rider Demo, and I'll go Services. And we'll move that into the Services folder. And you know what? I have to create that folder first, so let's do that. Services, and let's try something. Nope. Okay, 1 at a time. Refactor this, so I can use a shortcut. I'll use that for the next one, RO, and we'll move this to Rider Demo/Services. Hit Next, and it moves it into our Services folder. And I use the shortcut there, so Command R and then O. Services, whoops. Hit Next, and I've moved them in. And the nice thing about this is it automatically adjusted the namespaces as one of the options. So I should really pay a little bit more attention or have pointed that out. So there is this fixed namespaces checkbox here, which will change your namespace to match your folder structure and match your file system hierarchy, which is awesome. The other thing you can do is have it change the access modifier from or to public when necessary. So some nice little pieces here to make you a little more productive as you're moving files around. And I know projects that tend to be built in a rush, which is probably most of our projects, tend to get a little cluttered and need this kind of attention and reorganizing after a while. So ReSharper makes it pretty easy to move some things around there. Another thing I want to really make note of here is in our data fetch service, we've got our get data, but what happens to this get data if we want to start adding some parameters? So let's explore that. This is actually my favorite refactoring in ReSharper. So if I go to the refactor this, we'll use a menu, but we'll use shortcut next time. And I want to change the inlines or change the signature of this method to include some parameters. This is a really handy way and a really smart way of dealing with changing method signatures. So if I use this change signature dialog here, it displays the parameters in a list and allows me to move them back and forth and add defaults and all kinds of good stuff. So let's say we're going to get data, and get data needs to always take a, I don't know, let's say, let's supply a string, and let's call it just value string, or just value, or just text. It's probably a better way to do it. So I'm adding a text parameter here, and I'm actually going to use that to build my list. And let's go next on that. So now I've modified the signature of this, but when I modified the signature of that, it's not complaining about the interface, because that change signature refactoring is smart enough to go and adjust any usages of get data and the interface of get data to also include my new parameter, which is great. So if you've got a method that takes several parameters and you have to add another one, or you've got call sites all over your app that are using that particular method and you want to refactor it to add or reorder parameters, that change signature is absolutely key to making sure that you're not going to break your code. It gives you some really nice tools too, if you've got a lot of call sites around your app, to identifying those call sites and being able to fix them up in a really systematic way. So really, really great tool there. So what I'm going to do with that text is I'm just going to quickly make this all string interpolation here. And, you know, it's kind of funny because I'm thinking about this and going, well, you know, whoops, I thought that was going to pick up my brackets. It'd be nice to have a default value on that, but I think I'll just skip over that for now. So now I can use my text to actually get data. So yeah, I really like that refactoring. It's probably my favorite. So lots of great refactorings built in. You can kind of explore a lot of those through the refactor menu here. You can do all kinds of different things. So in our data fetch service, say we needed to do, say we wanted to treat this a little bit differently, and we wanted to actually have a variable for this. So it gives us the ability to introduce a variable. Maybe we don't want a single variable. Maybe we want to treat that as, say, we want to change the scope of that. So I can refactor this, and I can introduce a field so I can use it across my app. So I can choose where I'm going to initialize it. Just going to keep that in the current member. It's going to be private. And I can change it to a member variable. And as you can see, it keeps the naming nice, sticks with the naming convention. I do like the underscore naming convention myself. I know this is like a tabs versus spaces debate, but that's just my preference. So it makes it really easy to refactor that code and clean it up if I'm really lifting that to a higher scope and putting it in I want to use it as a class member across multiple methods, or if I wanted to persist between sessions and maybe check to see if data is, like really if I wanted to do something like this. And have it check to see if data is actually initialized, and it's only going to initialize it if it's uninitialized. So I'm actually going to undo that, but you can see how some of these tools are very handy with getting your app cleaned up and making sure that things are a lot easier to work on. So what I want to do here with my main page, and I'm going to do this just the super lazy way because this is a demo. I'm going to set up the binding context here so we can use that view model that we've created. So I'm going to create a new main view model, and main view model needs a data fetch service. So of course I'm not doing true dependency injection because I just don't want to muck around with bringing in any frameworks, bringing in a framework or anything like that. The one thing you'll see is immediately when I start changing things on my main page and accessing one of the, or setting one of the properties on it, it's giving me a tip to use the object initializer. So why not? Let's do that. Another thing is it gives me some couple more warnings out of the box here that I've got redundant code in place. So you can navigate through the different tips using option function, like basically option page down. So I'm using the arrow. I have a touch bar here, so I can also use function F2 to navigate. So you can navigate between or across your different arrows just by flipping around like that. So let's fix both these up, remove our redundancies, and whoops, the stacked arrow keys on this new Mac are a little jarring. And let's remove the unused directives in the file, and that's default for that one, that refactoring, which is nice. So away we go. We've got our binding context set up in our main view model, and we've got a data fetch service. Cool. So now our main view model is ready to consume that data that we've brought in. So let's just do something simple here. Let's create a list view. So there's some really nice XAML tools built into this too. Of course, you've got really nice IntelliSense in here. Item source, binding. So we've got nice IntelliSense. And I just realized on our main view model, we're not actually fetching data anywhere. So let's create a command for that. So let's go public command. And we'll call this fetch command. And we'll have a getter for that. Bring in the command. And then down our constructor, we'll create a new command. Actually, you know what? Let's use the refactoring for this. Let's initialize our property from constructor. Oh, no, that's not necessarily what we wanted to do. Let's shortcut that actually. So that's not necessarily what I want to do, but it gets me halfway there. Create a new command. And this new command is going to execute our data fetch service, get data. So in this particular case, we don't necessarily need to create data fetch service as a member on here, but just for I wanted to show how that works as far as a just from a refactoring tools perspective. Okay, so let's quickly set up a public list so we can view these strings. Call this data list. Oh, and I can't type, but let's just roll with it for a minute. And it's going to actually give me a hint here that I have made a typo in my data list, and we can rename that. So notices that I have a typo and helps us select a new name for it, which is great. So let's go down here and we'll set the data list. Equal to our get data. Of course, we have no setter. So what I need to do for these is actually give it a on property changed and a backing property. So let's quickly do that. So I can easily set this up as a property with a backing field just using a refactoring. So let's do that now. So there we go. We've got a property with a backing field. And here I want to invoke, this is actually I need a more complex statement body for this. So I'm actually going to use a statement body, and I'm going to set my value, and then I'm going to call on property changed for this member. So to notify the front end that we have new values. So now down here, this is an iList.
Okay, Dylan,
Yep.
maybe a very quick tip there.
Yeah.
So you now manually added that on property changed. You can also say, okay, make this a property with backing field and change notification.
Really, let's undo some of that. There's a refactoring built into that. See, this is nice. Ah, yeah, right there. So it knows that I'm implementing I notify property changed, and will do it for me. Very nice. Thanks, Martin.
You're welcome.
And we're going to fix this up to be iList because we're returning a type iList. And okay, so now when we load data into that into the data list, so when we execute our command, it will update the UI, which is awesome. Okay, now the last thing we want to do is expose that command. So we're going to do two quick things here on our UI. I'm going to create a button here. Command, bind it. What did I call that? Fetch command. Data list. Create an item template with a data template and a text cell. And we'll set the text, bind it to dot. And let's run this up quickly. Now I've written more code than I anticipated doing in this demo. So I think I'm going to stop this as soon as we get this up and running. I just want to show some debugging features and quickly cover a couple things around debugging, unit testing, and some version control and database tools. So while this is running up, let's just quickly dive into some of this. So I want to point out that there is a really nice set of database tools built into Rider out of the box. Supports a lot of different data sources. This is particularly key for mobile developers that are working with SQLite. SQLite, of course, is mobile developers' database of choice in most cases. And so you can browse and modify a SQLite database on the fly, which is awesome. Kind of in a pseudo-related note to that, there is and I'm not sure where my window is here. There's a device browser where you can actually pull data off of your Android device that's connected. It's funny, I'm flipping between two instances because I've just switched over to this new machine and I don't see it here, but you can, there is a device browser where you can browse your Android file system and potentially pull files off of it, which is a handy little thing to do. My button is not showing. Which is not ideal, probably because I have no text set on it. And probably because I've got this all in a stack layout and not sizing things correctly. So I'm actually just going to bail on this. The one thing I am going to show really quickly is a nice plugin here. So I'm going to just quickly bring up my NuGet package manager here and search for hot reload, Xamarin. So there's a third-party plugin that allows us to support hot reloading from Rider, which is nice. So when you are making changes to your XAML markup, you can use this hot reload plugin to immediately reflect the changes on screen. So once I've got it installed, I've also got the plugin installed here. You can install plugins just through the preferences window. So I've got the plugin installed here. So my hot reload plugin is installed. I've got it enabled. I've restarted Visual Studio or restarted Rider previously. Now if I want to enable the plugin here, I can just click this enable hot reload. I'm going to relaunch. And when this relaunches, I can make changes in real time to my XAML design surface and have it update right on the simulator. So I can actually see the changes as I'm making them, which is really handy. As that's launching, oh, here we go. So cool, so I'm getting my data back. So let's actually change this here. We'll remove this label. Safe areas is why I'm not seeing stuff. So actually, I'm just going to keep that in there because I don't want to mess around with adding the safe areas. Safe areas, of course, bumps things down, so it's not displaying behind the notch. So you can see there's a little bit of text. This exclamation mark here from Welcome to Xamarin Forms is behind the notch because I haven't turned on safe areas. I'm going to change this button to load data, and we're all going to hope that my hot reload works the way I expect. Of course, with demo magic, yeah, chances of that working are slim. So yeah, it didn't work, but it does usually work. Maybe I have to reload the project or something like that since I've brought in the assemblies. But you can check out the hot reload. There's some good documentation on the GitHub site for that. It's an open source project maintained by the community. So that's a nice little plugin. I'm just going to flip back to slides really quick just to finish us off here. So I covered a lot. The couple things I didn't cover, there's terminal baked right into the IDE, so you can get to your terminal really easily, which is nice. So if you're doing a lot of terminal work, I know I do a fair bit of my bash work, I work with bash a fair bit, and I do most of my Git work from the terminal. So having the terminal right available is great. Another thing I want to quickly point out is the scratches area. So this is like a nice little playground here where you can experiment with C# code or build things like this in particular, an HTTP request. So say I was building a local service and I wanted to test it out, then I could build an HTTP request right from here using the standard kind of REST client syntax to easily compose requests in here and send them out. So this is really nice when you're testing against a remote service. There's also some, if you're doing version control and you like to do version control with a UI, I am going to quit my little keycaster here. If you like doing version control with the UI, there's a nice source control plugin here for visuals or for managing your source control, your version control. There's also some built-in Git integrations, so it'll get your Git token for you and your Azure DevOps token if you're using Azure DevOps for source control. Let's see, there's also a couple of nice tools around. There is a very nice power save mode built in. So I can't quite remember where that is. Power save mode. So power save mode turns on your real-time code inspections to save your battery if you're on the go, which is nice if you're working on an airplane or something like that and need your laptop to last. So that's nice. There's a presentation mode where you can put it into a nice full screen distraction-free mode to quickly, you can quickly toggle that, and then you can easily demo, whatever you need. And then since I've got a second monitor here, it actually brings up a lot of the a lot of the UI utilities on the second monitor, so I can navigate from the second monitor and keep my demo kind of moving, which is cool. What else do we got here? Plugins. So last but not least, bunch of plugins available. There's some of the obvious ones, the hot reload that I touched on, Azure DevOps plugins. There's an Azure Toolkit for Rider, which allows you to browse your Azure services. So if you're working with Azure quite a bit, that toolkit's really nice. There's a cognitive complexity plugin out there, and that is basically, it's not looking at, it's trying to measure your code complexity and make sure you're writing maintainable code. So it gives you some metrics on that. Code Glance is a nice little utility they use that shows in the sidebar on the right-hand side of the screen and gives you a bit of a pictorial view of what your file structure looks like, very similar to what Visual Studio Code gives you, or something like Sublime. And then I've got these other two add-ins for Presentation Assistant and Key Promoter X. Presentation Assistant is that green bar that you saw down below that shows which keyboard shortcuts I'm using, and then the Key Assistant or Key Promoter X gives you some tips on when you're using the UI. It tells you, hey, you could do this with a keyboard shortcut. It shows you the keyboard shortcut, which is very handy if you're trying to work mouse free. And then the last piece is kind of just my own personal little things that I'd like to see implemented in Rider. So if you are using Rider and would like to lend your voice, there's a request out there to implement SourceLink. That's issue 16260, and to have an immediate window put into Rider. The debug experience in Rider is very good. There's a really great variables window that kind of functions as your local and your watch. Plus there's an evaluate expression window. It just doesn't feel quite as fluid as the immediate window. So I know there's quite a few people who have voted that one up, and I'd like to see it too. So that's my last thing. And that's all I've got for today.